bracing is a byproduct of two components. It's a byproduct of the muscular and it's a byproduct of the respiratory, right? So there's a respiratory brace, which is kind of what you talked about towards the end about the actual pressure in a enclosed system, right? So when people talk about belly breathing, which is a boomer topic that we need to cover, they're talking about this idea of pressure within the abdominal cavity. I would say that the best way to look at pressure is not necessarily in the abdominal cavity, but in the thorax at large, right? So when we think of the respiratory side of the brace, because the brace is a culmination of these two things, right? So there is the pressure component within the thorax, which I would say everything from the fucking apex of your lungs down to your pelvic diaphragm. And I'll explain why we use that language specifically here shortly, rather than just your diaphragm down to your pelvic diaphragm, right? So rather than just thoracic diaphragm to pelvic diaphragm, I think it's best to think about the apex of the lungs, which for those of you watching on YouTube, subscribe and then, just watch me do this with my hands. Apex of the lungs are going to be here, right? Kind of right near the collarbone or the clavicle. So I'm thinking from the apex of my lungs down to the pelvic diaphragm, or what some people would refer to as the pelvic floor. This is the closed pressure system that I'm worried about. Right? It's not just from the diaphragm down, because now you end up with this stomach-centric viewpoint on respiratory bracing, and it kind of leads you astray. So we have the respiratory component. Air in a closed pressure system is very powerful, right? Like, a pneumatic car jack, right? Pneumatic is the study in science of compressed air or gases. And then, hydraulics would be the fluid equivalent of that. So we have this pneumatic system that works alongside our mechanical ventilation and our gas exchange of what we call respiration. And then we have a muscular component, right? And you did a really good job of going, okay, we have this air piece and we have this muscle piece. And depending on the task, we're going to draw from these pieces to build a brace that's suitable for the thing we're doing, right? That's such a key component, or that's such a key concept to be able to break down into its component parts, where it's like, okay, everything has a task orientation to it, right? Because I think one of the things, if we're trying to meet people where they're at, and we'll include boomers into this, is, okay, one, breathing isn't bracing. Hopefully we got that squared. Okay, what is bracing? It's a culmination of the pressure that we can create, manipulate, use to our advantage to dynamically stabilize our spine through movement between pressure caused by air and ventilation or respiration, and the containing power of the external musculature that surrounds the rib cage and pelvis, right? So those are like the two components. And then it's like, okay, we have that done. Now, it's not, because this is the next thing bracing is not, it's not the stacked position. It's not, right? You watch, and I've seen it, you've seen it, like when you work in clinical practice as a chiropractor, you get a lot of people that come to you with low back issues. And, unfortunately, fortunately, depends on how you look at it. A lot of our colleagues, especially the more of the boomer persuasion, like the ones that are listening to podcasts on fucking Apple and voicing their opinion on Facebook, like they are telling and teaching people how to be in this stacked position. So like everything is square. Everything, you're never doing anything where your spine moves, right? And there's a pretty prominent spinal researcher who will go on these same podcasts. I can guarantee you without fail that the person who espouses this type of very rigid spine behavior has been on, I'm looking at the top 20, has probably been on 10 of the top 20 health and fitness podcasts on Apple.
That's wild.
And it is wild because people didn't subscribe to this show, right? That's why that message gets out. Now, maybe we don't want that because people still come into our clinical practice because they think that breathing isn't bracing. Yeah, I got it. Well, yeah, guess what? It's not what else you think it is, because what's left in your stupid old boomer head is that you think bracing is the stacked position. And that's also wrong, right? So I think that's sort of like the next layer I'd like to unpack is like the task specificity of bracing, because it is it's like a slider. It's like a switch. Like, okay, we know that regardless of the task we're doing, we have two tools at our advantage to begin to brace the spine. And those tools are the respiratory or the ventilation component of the air in the close pressure system. And then the second tool is the external musculature. So breaking people of that mold, because how many people, spinal flexion is the one that gets demonized. Hinging, deadlifting. I think this was another one of the boomer hot take machines that had been sort of spreading the airways lately, is like, don't flex. Did you see this one going around? Do you want to PR your deadlift, or do you want to play with your grandkids? Because you can't do both. End quote. Did you hear that?
No.
Now, I would call it medical negligence if the person had a clinical designation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You can give medical advice on the internet, and there's no repercussion now.
Do you want to have a first pass at that statement? Like, I got to compose myself. I'm standing. I'm already hot.
Yeah.
Like,
we'll let you compose yourself, but
thank you.
There's a demonizing of certain movements in this kind of boomer culture. Like, squats are bad for your back, bad for your knees. Like, you'll hurt your back if you deadlift, if you train heavy. But the big asterisk by this is that if you're doing these things appropriately and you're loading musculature and not structure, then the way that muscle adapts when it encounters greater load over time is that it adapts to be able to deal with greater load over time. And we call that strength training, right? And the difference between the way that muscle and structures adapt is that the way that structural components, whether that's bones, joints, ligaments, cartilage, sometimes tendons, if we're loading them in a way that is stressing them, that in a way that's inconsistent with joint mechanics, the way they're going to adapt is through inflammation. And inflammation over a long period of time under repetitive stress is going to be a signal for your body to lay down more calcium and more bone to stabilize this area. Because the way that we adapt through muscle and the way that we adapt through bone it's completely different. And when we start to adapt through bones and joints through inflammation and calcium deposit, that's called degenerative arthritis. And that can cause issues because it perpetuates that cycle. It makes it harder to move. There's more inflammation, and it is kind of a cascading event that positively reinforces itself. Now, the differentiation between loading musculature and loading structure in this specific case is how you're moving, your strategy to do a deadlift, right? And if you're doing a deadlift in a way where you are, yes, it's axial load regardless of how you do it. But if you're dispersing the load through musculature appropriately, and this is how it comes back to core bracing, is that core bracing, as I define it, a lot of times it is task specific, but the only structure we have between the bottom of our rib cage and the top of our pelvis is our lumbar spine, right? We have bones in the back, and yes, we have fascia and we have connective tissue in the front, but in the front, there's predominantly musculature. And that's going to be our strategy to disperse force through the front of the body, through that space between the rib cage and the pelvis. So if we're relying purely on the structure in the back of our body, then we're overloading structure as we go through hinging movements. But the idea of a brace is to create a strategy to disperse force circumferentially around the abdomen so that we're not overloading the spine itself in something like a hinge movement or in any movement where there is axial load. Now, if we're just demonizing a deadlift, look at what a deadlift is outside of the context of the gym, outside of a barbell. It's picking up your socks, it's picking up your shoes, it's getting the grocery bag off the ground. It's understanding mechanics that you can do for a long period of time because you have a strategy to load musculature and not just structure to be able to push your hips back and lower your center of mass with your hands closer to the ground. So deterring people from doing a movement like a deadlift, and also like picking up your grandkids, is essentially the same exact thing. Uh, I think that's a really dangerous lesson to preach, because now you're using fear to get talk someone out of doing something that could be much more beneficial for their health than there is a negative effect to that.
I just think, yeah, like there's the relative risk is what's lost here. And there's a couple things to highlight. One, there's a technical component to lifting weights that supersedes exercise selection. Let's start there,
Yeah.
right? And so we have two pretty egregious offenses of boomers overstepping their rank and frankly their scope of practice. We have the equivocation of a squat, jamming your fingers into a back door or into a back door. There you go. That's, yeah, how about jam it up your back door? Jamming it into a car door and fucking up your back or your knees. And then you have within weeks of each other, I think this latter one was previous, that you have an option between PRing your deadlift now or picking up your grandkids later, which I actually don't know which is a worse take. But let's linger. We've kind of touched on the squat one a little bit, so let's linger on the deadlift.